You're listening to Big World Network.
Just Kill Me, Season 2, Episode 4, Jabba the Hood. Written by Wendy Herman. Read by Wendy Herman. Trevor and I immediately got a hit on the license plate and couldn't drive fast enough to the well-known but officially top-secret headquarters of a local crime boss named Bastion Evers. Bastion was born on a small island in the South Pacific, so small it wasn't even tourist-worthy, and had come to America when he was 14. He was smart, but with no adults in his life to guide him, he had fallen in with the street crowd, the pickpockets and petty thieves, and had worked his way up through the ranks to the very top. Now, nearly 20 years later, he was the big cheese, and with his power he had grown fat and lazy, gluttonous in fact. His easily 400-pound girth was accredited to his addiction to American fast food, and there was an underground rumor that he hadn't left his chair in 6 months, because he couldn't. I took that to mean either he was actually physically stuck in the chair, or he couldn't lift his own weight anymore. Then again, it very well could be both. I tried not to think about how he was relieving his bodily functions if he couldn't get to a bathroom. Regardless, it had garnered him the nickname Jabba, which he seemingly took as a title of royalty. Trevor took a left turn too sharply, and my head hit the window. I scowled at him, but he didn't notice. He had refused to elaborate on Freya and I apparently both having had amnesia, which I was still trying to convince myself was a lie, and I finally had to let it go, in the interest of finding Freya as soon as possible. As we parked in the back lot of the specialty bookstore, the front for Jabba's real business, Trevor didn't bother paying attention to the parking spaces, and I didn't complain. We both hopped out, not having said one word to each other since we'd left headquarters. I decided to let him lead. She was his wife, after all, as much as that thought made me cringe. Trevor got to the back door and paused, pulling his gun from its holster and clicking the safety off. He pointed it in front of him and moved to open the door. I guess we're going in strong. I put my hand on his arm, lowering his weapon to point it at the ground. Trevor, what are you doing? Jabba's not the enemy here. He probably doesn't even know about Freya being kidnapped. The jerks who had us at gunpoint, I didn't recognize any of them. They didn't act like Jabba's guys. Let's be smart about... He cut me off. Until my wife is safe, everyone is the enemy. His eyes had a fire in them I'd never seen before, and I'd seen this guy in hand-to-hand combat fighting for his life. I suddenly got the feeling he was lumping me in the enemy category with the rest of the world. I sighed heavily and retrieved my gun, unlocking the safety, but only, I told myself, to shoot Trevor's gun out of his hand if he got carried away inside. He gave me a nod, careful to make eye contact as briefly as he possibly could, and I reluctantly returned the nod. He slowly checked the door. Unlocked. We ducked inside. We had entered through the employee entrance and silently crept down a long, narrow hallway. We passed a room that looked like it should be an employee lounge, based on the soda machine and full-sized fridge I could barely see on the opposite wall. But it had so many boxes piled up, some to the ceiling, there wasn't room for anyone to, lounge. Then there was a bathroom, surprisingly clean, and next to it was a small meeting room with a long table and several mismatched chairs. It was neat and tidy, as always. Jabba may be an obese slob, but he was also a clean freak and had had the same meticulous cleaning lady for 8 years. I knew this because, oddly enough, Janice was also my cleaning lady. We knew Jabba and his crew would be upstairs, in the loft of the old bookstore. That's where Jabba lived and where his throne was. Literally. He'd bought it online a few years ago, some leftover prop from a movie set, and he loved it more than a mother could love her child. We approached the bottom of the stairs, just before the heavy red theater curtain that separated the bookstore from the rest of the establishment, and still hadn't encountered any of Jabba's goons, or bounty hunters, as we jokingly called them at headquarters. The joke was twofold, as most of them were barely adults, and all of them were relatively harmless, except for the fact that they were low-grade criminals. One thing we hadn't discussed yet, Trevor and I, was what Jabba could possibly have to do with all this. Kidnapping wasn't his thing. I was secretly hoping he knew something, if only to get Freya back safely, but I was doubtful. The whole mess was nagging at the back of my consciousness as we slowly ascended the stairs. Jabba was unlike any other criminal I'd ever met. We called him a crime boss, but in reality he was more help to us than hindrance. Jabba had appeared on the FBI's radar 3 years before, when there was talk on the street of a new drug lord in town. What we discovered throughout that investigation surprised everyone at the Bureau. Not only did we uncover the drug lord and nail him, but it turned out not to be Jabba. Not even close. It seems Jabba's mother had been a drug addict when he was still living on his little island. He was too young to understand why she was sick, but he knew enough to stay away from the drugs himself, and did a pretty good job of keeping his younger brother away from them too, for a while. One day his brother's curiosity got the better of him, and Jabba wasn't around. His mother, apparently overwhelmed by the whole situation, and, one can only hope, blaming herself for her son's death, overdosed on heroin the next day. So 14-year-old Jabba hopped the next boat to the East Coast and ended up in our little Mecca, presumably scared and alone. He blamed drugs for taking his family away from him and vowed to never, and I mean never, have anything to do with them. It seemed our resident Hutt was a crime boss with morals. He also, we found out soon after that, never steals from pregnant women, mothers with children in tow, the elderly, or the mentally or physically challenged, and he holds all his subjects to the same standards. I wouldn't call him Robin Hood, but he was damn close, and you had to give the behemoth credit for running his below-the-law business the way he did. Plus, he was Trevor's #1 informant, and had been for 2 years. His specialty bookstore was legit and made a small profit, but most of his wealth came from behind the red curtain, and as long as we allowed it to happen, he would help in any way he could to keep our city drug-free. In this crazy mixed-up world, that seemed like a pretty good trade-off. We reached the landing and could hear voices coming from the room directly in front of us, the throne room. The door was cracked, and before we could formulate an entry plan, Jabba's booming voice bellowed from the other side of it. "Come in, gentlemen, but holster your weapons first, please." Trevor lowered his weapon but didn't put it away. I grabbed his arm, and when he glared at me, I met his glare tenfold. He hesitated, but then conceded and flipped on the safety before he slid it into the holster. I did the same, and we pushed the door open and entered. Jabba was sitting on his throne, which faced the door, with a large napkin tucked down the front of his quadruple extra-large Hawaiian shirt, and was just finishing up a Big Mac. There were at least 8 young men and women of various ages milling around the room. Some relaxed on the overstuffed couch, watching a rerun of Psych on the 52-inch plasma TV, a few playing video games on yet another giant screen, and several plopped in the far corner on dozens of pillows, reading. Although I merely glanced, I was sure one of them was engrossed in Oliver Twist. Appropriate. One beautiful young girl was attending to Jabba, and seemed very happy to do so. She cleaned up the McDonald's bag and stood next to the throne, with a soda cup as big as her head, waiting for His Majesty to feel parched. As he put the last bite, which would have been 4 bites for a normal human, in his mouth, he pulled the napkin out of his collar and wiped his mouth and hands, smiling at us the whole time. He finished chewing, far from 30 mastications by my count, and swallowed. He turned his head toward his attendant, and she put the straw to his mouth. After sucking down enough root beer to drown a St. Bernard, he thanked her sweetly, and then addressed us, still smiling. "Why do you enter Jabba's palace with your weapons drawn, friends?" Jabba spoke in the third person, which normally would have made Trevor smirk at me, but he was not in the mood today, it seemed. "Your boys kidnapped an agent this morning, Jabba. It seems you've become bored with petty crimes, he snapped. Jabba was genuinely confused and shocked by Trevor's accusation, which didn't surprise me one bit, but I knew I wasn't going to get through to Trevor. I only hoped Jabba could convince him. Agent Douglas, you know very well Jabba does not condone such acts. Why do you accuse Jabba of this? What evidence do you have? We have one of your cars at the scene, Trevor stated. Jabba had an inkling of recognition at that, and took a deep breath in, looking at the ceiling. Finally, he responded. The 1978 Caddy? Yes, I answered. Jabba, there were 4 men in that car this morning, and they took a female agent at gunpoint. Jabba rubbed his chin thoughtfully. 4 men? I nodded. He sighed. This morning, Jabba's 1978 Cadillac went missing, along with 6 of Jabba's wayward brothers. 6, I blurted out, before I could process what Jabba had said. He was claiming 6 of his men went rogue and kidnapped an FBI agent without his knowledge? This was one of the oldest excuses in the book, but I was inclined to believe him. Jabba believes 4 of them have bad juju. They were not content being in Jabba's family. They are greedy and not right in the head. Just how crazy do you have to be for someone like Jabba to call you not right in the head? I was getting an increasingly bad feeling about this, and I could sense Trevor was too. And the other 2? Asked Trevor calmly. The other 2 were motivated by financial hardship alone. They are good boys, and will be welcomed back into Jabba's palace, if they have not already done something unforgivable. Like kidnapping an FBI agent? Trevor asked, a slight edge in his voice. Jax and Case are not the brains of this treason, friend. Jabba believes Logan and his brothers in crime were given a job outside of his purview, and they were offered a lot of money to do so. Something in Jabba's coded language struck me. Jabba, what do you mean, brothers in crime? Were these 4 young men in prison together? Jabba smiled and pointed a ginormous finger at me. You are close, Agent Ripley. They were just boys when they met under dire circumstances. Just boys? They were in juvenile hall together? He grinned. Talking to Jabba was like working your way through a labyrinth. Trevor asked, If you knew all this, Jabba, why didn't you stop them? Or call us? Jabba looked sad now. Apologies, friends. Jabba found out only a moment before you arrived in his court. Sister Lila overheard their evil plan this morning and was concerned for brothers Jax and Case. He motioned to his personal attendant, and she gave a shy smile, but made eye contact with me for only a split second. Wait, I asked, why are you so worried about these other 2 boys? Jabba looked at Lila and she gave a nod, giving him permission to respond on her behalf. You see, friends, the poor young boys believe they are acting under Jabba's orders. They have been deceived by Logan and his evil intentions. Lila, do you know who gave the boys this job? Trevor asked gently. She just nodded and gave the same shy smile. We waited for a name, or anything, but she remained silent. Just then Jabba began signing to her. I had no idea he knew sign language, and I could tell it was a surprise to Trevor, too. So, Lila was deaf. Wait. But then how did she overhear the plan in the first place? Something wasn't right here. Jabba, I started, carefully choosing my words. How did she overhear the plan if she's deaf? I thought it was a valid question, but both Jabba and Lila gave me an offended glare. They returned to their silent conversation, Lila responding with lovely, flowing, feminine sign language. It was beautiful to watch. When they were finished, they both turned back toward Trevor and me. Jabba clasped his hands in front of him, which seemed to be quite a task, as his arms barely reached across his girth. Friends, Lila is not deaf. In fact, her beguiling ears perform better than yours or Jabba's. She is, however, speechless in a permanent sense. Her last boyfriend saw fit to separate her from her instrument of speech. He paused here to make sure we were understanding him. We both must have looked puzzled. I know I was, because he rolled his eyes slightly and sighed. He leaned forward a little, probably as far as he could, and spoke just above a whisper, and in a tone that reminded me the whole third-person thing was all an act. Her tongue, gentlemen. He tried to cut out her tongue. When he was sure we were following, he leaned back again, about the same as putting your seat on an airplane from its upright position to recline. He did not succeed fully, but the damage was done. She heard about Jabba's happy family and came here, where she is now safe from cavemen like Tony the Moose. Trevor and I looked at each other with intensity. We both recognized that name. He was number 1 on our bad guy list. He liked cutting people's tongues out, and every agent in the Bureau would like nothing more than to cut out his vile tongue with a rusty spoon. I thought I was catching on to where Jabba was leading us. Jabba, did Tony the Moose send the boys on this job? It was perfect. Of course, that meant Tony had Freya, and that thought made my stomach churn, but at least it was a step closer to finding her. Then I noticed Jabba was shaking his head. No, Agent Ripley. Jabba fears you will not like what you hear, but in the interest of maintaining our amiable relationship, Jabba has no choice. Trevor was growing impatient with Jabba's riddles. Jabba, tell us, please. This agent, she's in danger. Peace, friend. Jabba spoke so calmly, I actually felt a little more peaceful, but just a little. Then Jabba closed his eyes and took a deep cleansing breath, as if he was meditating. He opened his eyes and gazed at us. His concern was evident, but there was also fear in his eyes. But fear of what? This hooligan Logan? Tony the Moose? What he was afraid of was not clear, until he revealed the name we'd been waiting for. Lila overheard Logan telling the 3 others that the job came straight from your Director Pixley.
You're listening to Big World Network.